Thank you all for being here. Thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure and privilege and honor. And even though my grandparents came from Russia, I apologize that I don't speak Russian. So I'm going to talk about consciousness and whether quantum physics is necessary to account for consciousness in reference to a theory I developed over the past 20 years with Sir Roger Penrose. And what you see in the background is a nerve cell, and most people consider only what's happening at the surface membrane with receptors and ion channels at the membrane. But we think we need to go inside the neuron, here's the nucleus, to structures of the cytoskeleton, specifically microtubules that we think are quantum computers inside the neurons of our brains. So what is consciousness? We take it for granted that when we open our eyes, the world out there appears inside our head. And being is meant to imply having conscious experience, phenomenal awareness, as opposed to a robot or a zombie who might have complex behavior without any conscious experience. So being is meant to imply having consciousness, having awareness or experience. The question of how the brain produces consciousness and what consciousness is approached by many disciplines. For example, the neuroscientist who probes the brain with electrodes and MRI and so forth, the roboticist or artificial intelligence person who tries to copy the brain and emulate brain functions in a computer, the artist who attempts to capture the essence of experience in various forms of art, the physicist with studies of reality, for example, Schrodinger's cat, psychiatrists who probe the mind and the subconscious, the anesthesiologist who looks suspiciously like me, who studies how anesthesia takes away consciousness, meditators who go into their own deeper levels of awareness, and philosophers, including Western philosophers and Eastern philosophers. So let's begin with the question of when did consciousness arise? Here we see a brief history of the universe since the Big Bang up until fairly recently. And when did consciousness arise? Bing, if you will. Did Bing occur fairly recently with tools and language, as some people think? Or did consciousness occur with the first animal cells, eukaryotes, a couple billion years ago? Or did consciousness occur with the first life? Does all life have consciousness? Or did consciousness occur even before the Big Bang, as some Eastern philosophers and also Western philosophers such as Colin McGinn would argue? Let's boil this down to one question: which came first, consciousness or life? Now, most neuroscientists, Western scientists and philosophers, psychologists would say that life came first and that life gave rise to consciousness, that consciousness emerged in living systems, for example, due to complex computation in the brain. On the other hand, panpsychists, Eastern philosophers, people with spiritual orientation, proponents of Alfred North Whitehead, and quantum approaches, including the category that I would belong in, would say that consciousness is intrinsic to the universe and preceded life. Now, we'll come back to that question, but we should first address what is life, because I think consciousness and life are very closely related. And there's basically four types of approaches. One is functionalism, that really is a list of the properties and functions of life. For example, self-organization, metabolism, growth, adaptation, response to stimuli, replication, reproduction, and evolution. But non-living things have these properties. For example, weather patterns, like the Great Red Spot of Jupiter, has self-organization, it evolves, it responds to stimuli, and so forth. So I don't think that's the answer. In the 19th century, we had various forms of vitalism. People who described a unifying energy field, a life force, or élan vital pervading living systems. But that raises the question of what type of field. Electromagnetic fields didn't seem to work. They postulated unknown fields but were regarded as being unscientific, and vitalism became taboo as molecular biology developed and we learned about DNA and molecules and so forth. More recently, people talk about complexity, emergence, scale invariance, metabolism, self-organized criticality, edge of chaos, but there are many non-living examples of these. And finally, quantum vitalism, proposed initially by Erwin Schrödinger, who suggested life derived from quantum coherence and that memory was stored in aperiodic crystal lattices. But life was considered for many years too warm, wet, and noisy for delicate quantum coherence. People building quantum computers in the laboratory were plagued by any heat vibrations that would destroy the quantum coherence. So it was thought very unlikely that living systems at 37.6 degrees centigrade could have quantum coherence. But that has changed markedly in the last 10 years, and we'll come back to that. So in Western philosophy, the question of what is consciousness, for example, Plato, the idea is, and also modern neuroscience, that the world out there is all in our heads. The world out there is a representation. Being is in our heads. That seems like a straightforward assumption. But Plato realized that we didn't really know what reality was because of this. And he used the allegory of Plato's cave, in which prisoners can only see two dimensions. And for them, two-dimensional shadows were reality. They were unaware of 3 or 4 dimensions with time. And this suggests to some people that there are more dimensions or more levels of reality that we experience, that we can experience. So being here is in lowercase because it's not the full form of consciousness. Descartes realized a very similar thing. The only thing of which he could be certain was that he was conscious. I think, therefore I am. And he also realized that as far as he could tell, or anyone could tell, we could each be a mere brain in a vat, fed information by an evil genius. So here's a brain in a vat, and it's thinking, I'm walking outside in the sun, bing. And for the brain in the vat, that's as real as anything that we experience. Raising the question whether consciousness and reality both may be an illusion. Is consciousness an illusion, or is reality an illusion, or are both? So this is rather unsatisfying. Now, in Eastern philosophy, consciousness pervades a deeper level of reality. Being is everywhere, like an ocean, and people describe our individual consciousness as being like a wave in a giant ocean of consciousness. But what is reality? We don't really know what reality is, even in modern science. And the best description of reality, perhaps, is of a hierarchical level extending from our classical world down, going logarithmically down to the Planck scale, the basement level of the universe, at 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. If you plot the scale from the Planck scale, the very tiniest, up into the size of the universe on a log scale, we human beings are precisely in the middle. And that's an interesting phenomenon which may have some implications. Modern science considers the brain to be a computer with consciousness emerging from complex computation among individual neurons. So here's a bunch of neurons connected by synapses. This is likened to a computer network with variable switches between nodes. And the idea is that if we have sufficiently complex computation among neurons, then consciousness emerges as an emergent property. In this view, conscious perception occurs several hundred milliseconds after sensory input. So here we have a brain, and here's the thalamus, and sensory inputs from the eyes, from the ears, from our skin, from all of our sensory organs, go to the thalamus, and then in 3 steps result in consciousness. For vision, the information goes to the back of the brain, in visual cortex V1, which is not conscious. It then is sent to the front of the brain, to the prefrontal cortex area, and this is not conscious. And then there's a third wave that results in consciousness or correlates with consciousness. So Bing is in the third wave. And in a great advance in consciousness studies, we've gone to emojis now instead of Bing. Now, only the third wave is inhibited by anesthesia. I'm an anesthesiologist, and we actually use the first wave and the second wave in patients who are unconscious. The first wave and second wave are still there, but only the third wave is gone. And we use these, we use the third wave to, we use the first wave and the second wave to monitor the integrity of the spinal cord in spinal surgery, to make sure the spinal cord is intact. The brain is still active under anesthesia. What's gone fairly selectively is consciousness. EEG slows, but it's still there. So only this third wave. And this implies that the mechanism of anesthesia may hold the key to understanding consciousness. If we could figure out how anesthesia selectively takes away consciousness, sparing other brain functions, we could have a handle on what consciousness actually is. And I'll come back to that point. Now, the third wave, when it gets to the cortex, results in another set of 3 waves. So here's thalamic inputs, or from the back of the brain to the front of the brain, and from the front of the brain to other areas that go to the layer 4, and then from layer 4, it goes to layer 6, 1, 2, and 3. And then from layer 1, 2, and 3, in the red arrows, they converge on layer 5, these giant pyramidal cells, these pyramid-shaped neurons in layer 5 that send their apical dendrites to the surface of the brain. And when we measure EEG from the surface of the brain, we're really measuring these apical dendrites because they're vertical and everything else cancels out. So the pyramidal cells are responsible for EEG that we can measure from the surface. And we'll come back to that point. So it looks like Bing is occurring in layer 5 pyramidal cells. It may be elsewhere, but if you had to pick one place in the brain, that would be it, layer 5 pyramidal cells. So there's our happy face in layer 5. Now, mainstream theories, these include global workspace, predictive coding, higher order thought, integrated information theory. These are all basically cognitive architectures. They don't address the hard problem. The hard problem is why we have experience at all, why we're not robots or zombies. We could have complex behavior without any inner conscious awareness. Yet we do, at least I do. I assume you do, but I don't know. You could be zombies or robots trained to come to a lecture about consciousness. And from your standpoint, I could be a zombie cleverly programmed to talk about consciousness without having any. But I have it, and I assume you do. But why? The second problem with these theories is that free will is impossible, regardless of determinism, which is another issue, because consciousness happens 300 milliseconds after impingement of sensory information on our sense organs, and yet we often respond to those stimuli at 100 milliseconds. So if we're talking very fast and you say something and I answer back, the activity in my brain that correlates with what you said happens after I've responded. Therefore, many Western philosophers and most neuroscientists would say consciousness is epiphenomenal, at least for rapid interactions, and that we act non-consciously and have this illusion that that we were in conscious control. We're the activity that correlates with the unconscious activity. They don't answer. They can't answer that. So I think this approach is wrong. But the party line The understanding in most Western philosophy and neuroscience is that consciousness happens too late, and we're responding quite often non-consciously and have an illusion. This would be the position of Dan Dennett, for example. Finally, these approaches view neuronal states as inanimate bits, as simple on-off states at the level of neurons, with consciousness and cognition emerging from complex network activities. And people in artificial intelligence and the singularity would say that when we can, if we have a computer built like the brain, then we will have consciousness in the computer. I don't think that's right, because this view is really an insult to neurons. Treating a neuron as a simple bit, a 1 or a 0, doesn't take into account that it's alive, and we don't yet know what that means. And there are other examples to show that this can't be right. For example, consider a different type of single cell. A neuron is a cell, and consider a paramecium. It's one cell, it swims around, it avoids obstacles, it can learn, it can find food, it can find a mate. Here are two paramecia fused, having sex. This is kind of X-rated, I apologize for that. And whether paramecium is conscious or not, we don't know, but they may be, and they are certainly clever enough to do these cognitive functions without having any synapses. They're just one cell. So if a paramecium can be this clever, it's unlikely, to me at least, that our neurons are simple on-off states, ones or zeros. So how do paramecium do this? How do they perform these cognitive functions, whether they're conscious or not? Well, here's a paramecium, and you can see that these hair-like projections on the surface are called cilia. And in cross-section, they're shown here. And here's a cilium coming out of a paramecium. And in cross-section, we see that there are 9 pairs of structures called microtubules with an inner pair. And in a centriole, they're very similar. This is a structure called a centriole that is responsible for dividing chromosomes during cell division, mitosis. And that's what got me interested in microtubules some 40 or 50 years ago, actually. So these are found in almost all biological cells, and microtubules or similar structures are found in all living cells. So how do they do this? How do the cilia bend back and forth in a coordinated fashion to move the cell in a proper direction? And if they bump into something, they are distended and they transfer that information into the cell. So what does this have to do with modern biology? Well, here is how they do that. Here's a cilium, and these things bend back and forth by motor proteins called dynein, which contract and cause the cilium to bend back and forth to cause it to move in a purposeful cognitive way and to do useful things. Well, this turns out to be very similar to what's happening in our brains right now. So here is a neuron from a brain with its axon and several dendrites, and synapses may be out here to receive inputs from a different neuron. And if we look inside the dendrite, we see, in this case, one microtubule. There's actually many of them. And the same dynein, the exact same motor protein, moving material along. So material that is going to be used for this synapse is synthesized in the cell body and must be transported to a particular place by these motor proteins. And they have to jump from microtubule to microtubule, have to go right or left at branching points. And the question is, how do they know where to go, where to deliver their cargo? And it turns out that a microtubule-associated protein called tau is bound at specific points on the microtubule lattice and is a traffic signal or a code to tell the kinesin or the dynein where to get off, to deliver its cargo to this synapse or that synapse or particular synapse that needs to be reinforced in synaptic plasticity. So the placement of tau on a microtubule is specific and encodes a form of memory. Now, what happens when we lose tau or we lose microtubule integrity? Well, that results in Alzheimer's disease. So in Alzheimer's disease, we have the amyloid plaques on the outside of neurons, and then inside we have microtubules which are disintegrating and falling apart, releasing their tau, shown in the blue, which form what are called neurofibrillary tangles, and we lose memory, and we lose cognition, and eventually we lose consciousness. The same thing happens in something called postoperative cognitive dysfunction, or POCD, when people, usually very young babies or very old people, need many, many anesthetics, and they get repeat anesthetics, and over time they begin to lose memory, and this is called POCD, and it's a problem in my field of anesthesia. And the pathology is almost identical to Alzheimer's disease and also to Down syndrome dementia. Now, if we go back to where consciousness is most likely to be happening in the pyramidal cells, and we look inside the pyramidal cell, we see microtubules, which are, interestingly, are interrupted and of mixed polarity. They're an opposite polarity, pointing different directions. Now, in all other cells and in axons, the microtubules are continuous and arrayed like spokes of a wheel from the center of the cell outward to the periphery. But in dendrites and soma, and only in dendrites and soma, they're interrupted and of mixed polarity, pointing in different directions. So microtubules are part of the cytoskeleton, which is thought to be the skeletal structural support of the cell. But if you wanted structural support, for example, in your leg, you wouldn't break your femur bone and have it next to each other. That's not good for support. So there must be some other reason, and we think it's to optimize information processing and to have resonances from microtubules pointing in different directions. And here's a picture of a microtubule, and as you can see, it's made of these individual proteins called tubulin, peanut-shaped proteins that can be in multiple states multiple states and interact with neighbor states, and therefore represent information as patterns. Now, I got interested in microtubules when I was in medical school in the early 70s, and was fascinated by them. I learned about computers at that time, and their structure was discovered, and I got the idea that they might be processing information to account for mitosis and processes in the brain by each tubulin representing a state, for example, a 1 or a 0, black or white, and that patterns could propagate and move through the microtubule. So that microtubules were acting like computers and were some type of molecular computers. And I published, for example, in 1982 in the Journal of Theoretical Biology, a model of information processing in microtubules, wrote a book in 1987 about computing in microtubules and so forth. And then later, with Roger Penrose, developed further ideas of microtubules as quantum computers. And we'll come back to that point. So I mentioned memory. So let's talk a little bit about memory. And most views of memory are by synaptic plasticity. So here's an axon at the top, releasing neurotransmitter vesicles across the synapse to bind to receptors on the dendrite, on the postsynaptic membrane. And most people would say that memory is due to the level of sensitivity at the synapse. So that if you have a network of neurons, the sensitivity at the synapse will channel information through that network. And that's how you get cognition and consciousness. But the problem with that explanation is that these proteins are very transient. They last only hours to days, and then they're recycled by microtubule-related phenomena, and yet memories can last lifetimes. I have memories going back to at least when I was 4 years old, maybe earlier, and you probably do also. And these proteins are long gone. We think the following is happening. There's an enzyme called CAMK2 that when neurotransmitters bind, they release calcium. It activates this enzyme, which then binds to microtubules and other proteins. So what does that mean? Here's CAMK2. It's a rather beautiful hexagonal molecule. Here we look at it on the end and here from the side. And when calcium comes in, when the synapse is activated, the CAMK2 extends 6 kinase domains, like arms or legs, upwards and downwards, and has phosphorylation domains. And it phosphorylates something inside the neuron which can encode and store memory. So we got the idea that this might be binding and phosphorylating microtubules to encode memory. And in this paper in 2012, my colleagues Travis Craddock and Jack Tuszynski compared the geometry and size of CAMK2 with a microtubule lattice, the A lattice or the B lattice, and we showed that the match was perfect, that the CAMK2 perfectly matched the hexagonal lattice, either the A or the B, and suggested that memory is encoded in microtubule lattices by CAMK2 phosphorylation. So the idea is something like this. CAMK2 comes in from the synapse, binds to microtubules, 6 kinase domains, and can leave a memory trace which might bind tau or change the microtubule state, and then goes on its way, leaving a memory trace behind. So this is our candidate for memory encoding in microtubules, and I haven't seen a better explanation, but of course I'm biased. I like this one. These patterns that happen in microtubules are similar to X-bar structures, which are suggested to be the structure of language. Noam Chomsky is a famous neurolinguist, language expert, who believes that there's some biological structural basis for language. And one way to show this is by showing that sentences can be represented by these branching X-bar structures that are hierarchical, where you have a noun phrase, verb phrase, and various phrases that can represent language and sentence structure hierarchically. And I met with Chomsky earlier this year, and he liked this idea that I'm about to tell you, that microtubules might be the site for these types of X-bar structures, because they have not been found at the level of neuronal networks. So, for example, here's a sentence. She studies physics at the university, and these may be looked at hierarchically, where the meaning and the intention inflection phase leads to different levels that results in this sentence. And yet, time-wise, the sentence is comprehended up here somehow. This is somewhat mysterious. So I've been working on an idea that microtubules represent X-bar-like structures in their structure. So here's this sentence represented in a microtubule lattice. And in a study earlier this year for Chinese and English speakers, Ding et al., working with a group at NYU, showed sentence comprehension for both English and Chinese correlated with hierarchical levels of EEG. Now this is a rather complex slide, so just look over here for the moment. We have the hierarchical arrangement of a sentence. The whole sentence with its comprehension is made of phrases. Each phrase is made of words. Each word is made of phonemes or syllables, and somehow you get meaning and qualia out of that. And they showed that the sentence is comprehended at a fairly slow rate in the EEG at 3 hertz, phrases somewhat faster, 10 hertz, and words in gamma synchrony up to, say, 100 hertz. And I've suggested that if you can go deeper inside neurons, and this correlates with the brain, with neural networks and individual neurons, and that we should go inside neurons to the cytoskeleton and even deeper into individual microtubules and faster for meaning and qualia. So this is a work in progress, and I'll be meeting with Chomsky in the spring and hope to develop this model further. Okay, so stepping back a second, we have brain computational capacity. Now, people in artificial intelligence in the singularity would say the brain computation is based on neurons firing. So we have 10 to the 11th neurons in the brain, about 1,000 synapses per neuron, and acting at about 100 hertz. This gives you 10 to the 16th operations per second per brain. Now the singularity people and the AI people will say when we get to 10 to the 16th operations per second per brain, we'll have brain equivalents in a computer, so just give us a few more $1 billion and we'll have it. You know, we just need to build faster, bigger computers. But I don't think that's right, because if you look at the microtubule level, you have 10 to the 11th neurons per brain, the same, but you have a billion 10 to the ninth tubulins per neuron operating at about 10 megahertz, and I'll explain that a little bit later. This gives you 10 to the 16th operations per second per neuron, the same as they claim for the whole brain, and 10 to the 27th operations per second per brain. So this pushes the target for brain equivalents just on the computational capacity level way, way downstream, further down the field. So the AI people don't like this idea at all and have been very critical of it. But I think they're being very naive, thinking that a neuron is a single bit. However, where's consciousness? Why would computation per se explain consciousness? We have big, fast computers. They're not conscious. Where's the Bing? Is something else required, and is that quantum physics? And I would say it is. So in the early 90s, I was going around to AI neural network meetings saying that you guys need to go to 10 to the 27th, and they said, oh, go away, you bother me. They didn't like the idea. But then one day somebody said to me, well, how would that explain consciousness? How would that explain feelings, emotions, what are known as qualia now, and what later came to be known as the hard problem by Dave Chalmers? How would that explain consciousness? And I had to admit I didn't know. I had become a reductionist, and I was somewhat embarrassed by it because I didn't think that was the right approach. Something was missing. Well, fortunately, at that time, I read this book by Roger Penrose, The Emperor's New Mind. And in that book, Roger argued against the idea that consciousness was merely computation. He said, basically, using Gödel's theorem, that conscious understanding is non-computational. It's something other than computation. Something else was required. Something outside the computational system. For example, a computer might be programmed to play chess and might beat us at chess, but it doesn't understand the game. And John Searle famously described his Chinese room argument where someone is given Chinese characters and a lookup table to be able to translate into English or any other language, but didn't really understand Chinese. So computations could be done without any understanding, and yet we have understanding. So something was missing. That something, Roger concluded, is most likely to be involved with quantum state reduction. And reduction here doesn't mean reductionist because it means quantum state reduction or collapse of the wave function. And having to do with the measurement problem in quantum mechanics. And that this quantum state reduction, to make another leap, was related to the underlying structure of the universe, space-time geometry, or quantum gravity. So I read this book, and I hadn't really thought about quantum physics very much, but I was really impressed by the level of his thinking and that he had proposed a mechanism for consciousness unlike anybody, not only unlike anybody, nobody had ever proposed a mechanism for consciousness. Consciousness was thought to be an emergent property without specifying at what level, or maybe fundamental without explaining how it could relate to the brain, but he had a specific mechanism. And so I dove into trying to understand quantum physics, and as Richard Feynman once said, nobody really understands quantum physics. Roger probably comes the closest. So in a nutshell, let me just say that our world that we experience, or the world, is divided into two realms, kind of like the yin-yang, with the quantum and classical worlds. The classical world is what we're familiar with. Everything is localized. You see one of me, I see one of each of you. Things are definite in particular states. They act like particles, and generally they're fairly large. But at small scales, and we don't know how small is small, we have this weird situation called quantum superposition, where things can be in multiple states or locations at the same time. This pointer could be here and here at the same time. And yet we don't see that. Why don't we see quantum superpositions in the classical world? This is known as the measurement problem in quantum mechanics, why we don't see it. And it's exemplified by a famous thought experiment by Erwin Schrödinger. Schrödinger's cat being both dead and alive. And the idea is that there's a quantum particle, like a photon both going through a half-silvered mirror and being reflected. And if it's reflected, it goes into the box, triggers the poison, and kills the cat. But because it also continues, Schrodinger concluded that the cat would be both dead and alive until it collapsed to one or the other. Now, what that situation how that might resolve, I'll come to in a second. But let's first address the question of how something can be in two states or two locations at the same time. This is still a mystery. The only explanation I've ever seen is from Roger Penrose, who addressed the question of what superposition is, how particles can be in two or more locations at the same time. And to do so, Roger connected quantum mechanics with general relativity, two branches of science that have been unable to be fused in any meaningful way. We know that from general relativity that mass is equivalent to curvature in space-time geometry, in the structure of the universe. So a prediction of that experiment back in the early part of the 20th century was that light from a distant star behind the sun would be bent by the mass of the sun and could be visualized on Earth, even though it was directly behind the sun. So Sir Arthur Eddington went to the top of a mountain during an eclipse when the sun was blotted out, and sure enough was able to see a star that he knew was actually behind the sun. So the mass of the sun curved space-time so that he could see it. So it works for large-scale space-time and large-scale massive objects like the sun. Well, Roger said the same thing must be true of small entities, small particles. So for example, a particle in one location would be a curvature of space-time. So here he's taking four-dimensional space-time and converted it into a two-dimensional sheet so we can see it easily on a screen. And a particle over here would be a curvature there. A particle over there would be here. So the particle oscillating back and forth would be actually space-time geometry, curvature oscillating back and forth. And then superposition, the particle being in both places, would be two curvatures in space-time geometry, two simultaneous curvatures in the structure of the universe. So we'll keep that in mind and come back to that point and apply it to the measurement problem in quantum mechanics. Why don't we see definite states in our perceived world? Well, one possibility is called the multiple worlds hypothesis, or multiple worlds interpretation. And this is actually very popular. It's said that every possibility continues and it evolves its own universe. So every possibility branches off and forms its own world. And we have multiple worlds. So in one world, the cat is dead. In one world, the cat is alive, dead, alive, dead, alive. So that there's this infinite number of overlapping universes. This seems rather unsatisfying. Nonetheless, it's very popular. Another possibility that was put forth by Niels Bohr, Eugene Wigner, von Neumann, more recently Henry Stapp, David Chalmers, and Kelvin McQueen, that conscious observation, so here we see the conscious observer, looks at the cat, you open the box, and then and only then does the cat become either dead or alive. And this was the point that Schrodinger was making, because this was popular back then, how absurd this situation was that the cat could even be both dead and alive until observed. Nonetheless, this is a fairly still a very popular interpretation, because it's pragmatic. It allowed Bohr and others to continue to do experiments. But it raises the question of what is consciousness, because it puts consciousness outside the system, outside science. And it's a dualist position, because it doesn't say what consciousness is. It's some mysterious entity out there that causes collapse in our scientific world. So it's also unsatisfying. Now, Roger himself came up with a third possibility that I think is most likely to be correct. He turned the Copenhagen interpretation that the observer causes collapse, he turned it around, upside down. He said that rather than consciousness causing collapse, collapse causes consciousness, or collapse is consciousness. But he needed a way for collapse to occur on its own. And what he said was that these superpositions of possibilities, which are equivalent to space-time geometry, would be unstable. Or before I get there, if we consider that that the separation space-time geometry, if these separations would continue, we'd get multiple worlds. So this possibility would form universe 1. This possibility would form universe 2. So that's a way of accounting for the multiple worlds, but I don't think that's right. But instead, he said that these superpositions are unstable and will self-collapse and undergo objective reduction, quantum state reduction by an objective threshold, or OR, at a time t given by the indeterminacy principle, basically h bar over E sub g, where E sub g is the gravitational self-energy. This is the only equation I'll show. So that the superposition of separated space-time continues until time t equals h over g, and objective reduction occurs. And he said that this would be accompanied by a moment of conscious awareness. Bing. Bing would happen when collapse occurs, whenever collapse occurs, wherever it occurs. And it would inevitably occur because these separations are unstable and the universe doesn't want to fly apart. It self-collapses to maintain one universe with separations here and there. Now, some of these may be pleasurable. Some of these feelings, some of these beings may feel good, and some may not. They would be random. These would be occurring everywhere. They'd be occurring in the lectern, in the floor, in the air, in all the cells in our body, other than outside the brain, but would be random and disconnected, and what we call proto-conscious. So these would be occurring everywhere, all the time, kind of like panpsychists believe that consciousness is everywhere as a property of matter. This would say that consciousness is occurring, or proto-consciousness is occurring everywhere as a result of the self-collapse all around us. But these moments of awareness of experience are disconnected and lack meaning and cognition. So they don't amount to anything, but they're there nonetheless. It puts consciousness as a fundamental property of the universe, specifically due to collapse, which forms the material universe, and then each particle goes into superposition again. This would be occurring in the universe all along. Now, if that's the case, we might ask the question, remember we were asking which came first, consciousness or life? Did this OR-mediated proto-pleasurable feelings spark the origin of life? And I think it may have. We know that life on Earth apparently began in what's called the primordial soup, proposed in the 1920s by Oparin and Haldane. Oparin was a Russian and Haldane was British. And the primordial soup was said to be a simmering mix from which biomolecules emerged 3 to 4 billion years ago. In the 1950s, two scientists at the University of Oregon in the US simulated the primordial soup in an experiment, adding the materials that were known to exist at that time with some lightning, with sparks to act as lightning and energy, and then looked in the collecting trap to see what kind of molecules they had found, they could find. And what they found were what are called amphipathic molecules. Amphipathic refers to the fact that these molecules had two types of entities, a nonpolar end, kind of like oil, like benzene, and a polar end, kind of like water. So this end would be soluble in water, but this end would be oil-like, and oil and water don't mix. These molecules look a lot like dopamine, which is the pleasure molecule in our brain. Very, very similar to dopamine, which is an amphipathic molecule, an amino acid. A neurotransmitter, and similar to certain amino acids like tryptophan and phenylalanine. They have nonpolar oil-like rings, which are pi resonance clouds at one end, and polar water-soluble tails on the other. Now, let's take a minute to consider pi resonance. This is the basic building block of organic chemistry. Most or many of the molecules that make up our bodies are like this and have this organic molecule, which has 3 extra delocalized pi orbital electrons that are unbound. And they get together and form these electron clouds. So they form non-local electron clouds where the 3 electrons are spread out over the whole molecule. They're not in any one place. They're delocalized in a quantum state. And these support various types of dipole oscillations, excitons, and so forth, which are quantum happenings, quantum events. So raises the question, did life and consciousness derive from pi resonance in biomolecules, since these are key molecules in our bodies and brains? Uh-oh, we're missing something here. So let me just tell you what's missing in this slide is that if two of these pi resonance clouds get together, they're attracted to each other, and the electron clouds, dipoles, oscillate back and forth in terahertz, which is infrared. So they tend to have these natural oscillations in the infrared region. So these amphipathic molecules, because oil and water don't mix, the nonpolar ends tend to attract each other by these van der Waals attractions and oscillate back and forth, and the polar ends stick out to become water soluble. And this is exactly how proteins fold and form. So aromatic amino acids, when proteins fold, attract each other and form regions inside the protein which are nonpolar and can support quantum events, and the polar ends, the water-soluble ends, stick out into the exterior and are soluble in water. That's how proteins are soluble in water, because their exteriors are charged, but the interiors are nonpolar. So the oil-like molecules are segregated from the water. And these form what are called micelles, and this term was coined by the Russian Oparin, which were thought to be precursors to biological cells and also to biomolecules. Micelles self-organize with oil-like nonpolar interiors and polar water-soluble exteriors. This is how proteins are soluble in the blood, for example, and proteins fold in this way. Also, lipid membranes, lipid bilayers, have the same structure with the nonpolar oil-like interiors and, for example, cholesterol molecules, and polar charged entities sticking out inside the cell and outside the cell to be soluble in water. Nucleic acids like DNA have the same structure with an interior pi stack in DNA and RNA. So pretty much all biomolecules are organized in this way to have nonpolar interiors which can support quantum effects. And my colleagues and I, Tuszynski and Craddock, have called this the quantum underground, underlying biomolecules. So inside all of our biomolecules, our membranes, our proteins, our nucleic acids, are these quantum-friendly regions pervading our bodies. So we call that the quantum underground. And that can explain how quantum events and quantum coherence can occur at warm temperatures. It's also noteworthy that psychoactive molecules, for example, the neurotransmitters dopamine, which is the pleasure molecule, serotonin, the mood molecule, have these pi resonance clouds, and psychedelic drugs, which cause hallucinations and the psychedelic effect, like LSD, DMT, and psilocybin, also have these more complex aromatic nonpolar regions. And pretty much all psychoactive molecules have these pi resonance groups within them. Okay, back in the primordial soup, when life began. I've suggested in a recent paper that these micelles would form, and the nonpolar pi resonance clouds would get together, and there would be more than 3, there would be hundreds, maybe thousands, would reach threshold for objective reduction and consciousness by this formula, h bar over E sub g, and bing, consciousness would happen, a very primitive form of consciousness, because it was connected to the fine-scale structure of space-time geometry. So, raising the question, did this type of phenomenon, this primitive pleasure, spark the origin of life? did life form in order to have and optimize pleasure? As I said before, some of these would feel good and would be what we call proto-conscious, and raising the question, or I propose that life evolved to feel good, that my cells began to have simple proto-conscious moments, and this led to provided feedback for self-organization to optimize pleasure. And I think, so I published this chapter just came out, The Quantum Origin of Life, How the Brain Evolved to Feel Good. And if anybody wants, it's in this book on human nature, or send me an email and I'll send you a copy of it. Because I think, well, how would the feedback work? How would mental states affect, how would a system optimize consciousness? And one way would be because these pi resonance rings have only a few possible states that are stable. The sandwich is unstable. The T and the parallel displaced are stable, and these are alternate possibilities. And it could be something like this, where this arrangement feels bad and this arrangement feels good. And so the feedback to optimize pleasure would be to put them in this configuration to optimize pleasure. Now, this relates to evolution, of course, and Darwinian evolution is a pillar of modern science. But the notion that life evolved behavior to promote gene survival, for example, Dawkins' idea of the selfish gene, I don't think is right. It's an assumption. It doesn't make any sense for the following reasons. Behavior is driven by reward, by pleasure. If you do experiments in psychology, Pavlovian experiments, or any type of experiments, reward mediated by dopamine is usually, is always the driving mechanism. And in our lives, we're driven by pleasure also, not necessarily hedonism type of pleasure, but also altruism. It feels better to give than to receive. Spiritual pleasure, resonance, harmony with the universe, these all feel good. So our behaviors are also driven by pleasure. And I think there's no reason to think that this wasn't happening all the way from the beginning. For example, there were no genes in the primordial soup. So it was, I don't know, 1 billion years between these simple mice cells and when we had DNA. So how did we get from point A to point B? How did these molecules and systems self-organize? So I think this is a possibility. And Darwinian evolutionary theory ignores consciousness and feelings. Consciousness is assumed to emerge at a higher level of complex computation, but it's more likely that consciousness is intrinsic. I mean, the Eastern philosophical approaches would say consciousness is everything, and it's consciousness preceded life. So I think this takes advantage of both possibilities, and that evolution is driven by towards optimizing pleasure. And everything organisms do, they eat organisms because they taste good, they avoid pain, they mate because it feels good. So I think that feelings and optimizing pleasure is the driving force in evolution, and as shown in this cartoon. But after the primordial soup, then what happened? How did proto-pleasurable OR moments become orchestrated to full, rich, conscious experience? Can there be quantum coherence in warm, wet biology? I mentioned that this was a problem because because technological quantum computers must operate at absolute zero temperature to avoid decoherence. And this was a big objection to our theory because people said, well, to build a quantum computer in the laboratory, it needs to be at absolute zero, and the brain is too warm. However, about 10 years ago, it was shown that plants utilize quantum coherence by exciton transfer among what are called chromophores, which are pi resonance groups. So here's a part of a plant protein, and not shown here is the part of the complex that absorbs photons from the sun, and the energy is converted to excitons, propagating through all these chromophores simultaneously in superposition, quantum coherent superposition of the energy going through all these pathways simultaneously for the most efficient transfer to get the energy down here where they're converted to food. So without this highly efficient energy transfer, there wouldn't be food production, and we may not exist. There may not be, plants would not produce food, and we wouldn't be around to eat animals, and us wouldn't be around to eat the plants, and life may not exist. So if a potato or a carrot can utilize quantum coherence, it seems likely that our brains could. And so the question is, could such a mechanism support cognition and consciousness in animals? And I think the answer is yes. For example, I skipped over this part. Okay. So, and I think it's happening in the microtubules. So when I read Roger Penrose's book in 1991, as I said, he was looking for he had a mechanism for consciousness in this objective reduction, but he didn't have a biological quantum computer to implement it. And so I suggested to him that it was microtubules, and we met in the early 1990s, and here we are after the first Tucson conference at the Grand Canyon. There's Roger, there's me, there's Dave Chalmers, some of you may know him. And here we are a few years later at a conference in Stockholm where Roger was being mobbed, literally, and I was protecting him, a little bit worried that he was going to get crushed by his admirers. And we began to develop our theory of orchestrated objective reduction, where the OR-mediated conscious awarenesses that are occurring everywhere would literally be orchestrated by microtubules. That was, I brought the microtubules as the quantum computers that can mediate objective reduction. And as we saw before, that's the structure of microtubules. So the basic idea is that you had microtubules, actually many, many microtubules with superposition evolving and reaching threshold for consciousness and having a moment of being and a moment of consciousness, which is actually due to processes in the underlying level of space-time geometry that was creating the structure of the microtubules, specifically the pi resonance. And the idea is that basically that the structure of that the qualia of the redness of the rose, where most people would say it's the pattern of information processing in the brain, is because the qualia of the rose is actually a pattern in space-time geometry that is reproduced in the brain. And Bing is occurring in the brain because the same patterns of space-time geometry, here is shown as 3 curvatures, but it would be much more complicated, is occurring in our brains. And therefore, we have the qualia in our brains. Now, how does this happen in microtubules? Well, here we see one tubulin, and we look inside, and we see that it has these 8 tryptophans, which are pi resonance clouds, that are distributed throughout the tubulin. And this is very similar, actually strikingly similar, to the array of chromophores in the photosynthesis protein. They've actually discovered an 8th. And so the same sort of propagating of quantum energy, quantum entities through this may be happening in microtubules in a tubulin, except there's another tubulin, and so it can go on for macroscopic distances. Now, each tubulin actually, in addition to the 8 tryptophans, has a number of pi resonance clouds in phenylalanine and tyrosine, and there are 86 of them, 86 pi resonance clouds in each tubulin in a microtubule, about 1 billion tubulins per neuron, and then 100 billion neurons per brain. And so each of these, the relation to each other, could give a moment, could give a qualia or a feeling. So this is a cartoon, obviously, but the possibility of various emotions and feelings, even in one tubulin, is pretty large considering the permutation. So I'm using emojis there to represent the possibility of feelings and emotions. So the basic idea in our theory is that there's these quantum dipole oscillations through the microtubules, which can also go in superposition of multiple possible states and in a fractal-like hierarchy. So you might say, okay, that's good theory. Is there any evidence for that? And actually there is. This is the work from the lab of Anirban Banyapade in Japan, National Institute of Material Sciences, where he studied quantum resonances in microtubules. So he started with two neurons. So here's one neuron, here's a second neuron, and then he went down in scale to a microtubule and then to tubulins. And he applied these nanoelectrodes to stimulate the first neuron to see what combination of frequencies would result in activity in the second neuron. And what he found was that specific patterns called triplets of triplets. So he had three peaks in each frequency area, and each of those peaks had three inner peaks, so triplets of triplets, and then that repeated at megahertz, kilohertz, and hertz for the whole neuron level. So kind of like a fractal hierarchy. And if he then repeated at the level of individual microtubules and got similar peaks at faster, at gigahertz, megahertz, and kilohertz. So as you go smaller, you get faster. And then at the level of individual tubulins, he got terahertz, which is infrared, which is the pi resonance oscillations, gigahertz, and megahertz. Now, if you put this all together, we get a picture that looks something like this, where the whole brain would be over here, way over there, and then you have one neuron, and inside the neuron you have a microtubule, and inside that you have these tubulin pathways with dipole oscillations, and inside there you have the pi cloud dipole oscillations, and this is where anesthesia works, and I'll come back to that point. But if you plot these resonances on a log scale, you start from the very slow EEG, and then when you get into microtubule bundles, you get into 100 to 1,000 hertz, and then you get 10,000 hertz in microtubules, and then you get megahertz, millions of hertz, and then billions of hertz in tubulin, and I guess that'd be trillions or quadrillions of hertz, 10 to the 12th terahertz, which is infrared. So we have this hierarchical, fractal-like arrangement of oscillations, kind of like music, and where you have a high frequency, different octaves, except these octaves are separated by about 2 to 3 orders of magnitude. And I think that the brain is a fractal-like hierarchy resonance system, more like an orchestra really than a computer. It may do computing, but I think consciousness is more like music, metaphorically, and the brain is more like an orchestra operating at different resonant frequencies. So, and that anesthesia works at this fast frequency. So this is kind of the big picture where ORCOR is occurring, starts at this very fast frequency and cascades upwards. And we also think that EEG, which is brain waves, which are from a few hertz to up to 100 hertz, are actually, and EEG has been used for 100 years or so, but nobody really understands where it comes from and why what the real meaning is. And we think that EEG is actually beat frequencies, interference beats, interference patterns of faster vibrations, for example, of microtubules in megahertz range. So if you know you have two musical instruments that are very closely tuned but slightly off, they'll interfere and give a beat at a much slower frequency. So we think that this is one hierarchical fractal-like system, with the EEG being the very slow end. Now, if you go this way, you go into the whole brain and so forth. Well, what happens if you go the other way, faster? I guess I don't have that slide. Okay, never mind. The mechanism of anesthesia holds the key to understanding consciousness, as I said. So as I showed you previously, we think, well, let me just say that if we go faster, I often get asked about out-of-body experiences and the possibility of afterlife. And if consciousness is happening at the level of space-time geometry, which I believe it is, normally the space-time geometry in the brain, in the microtubules, then it could be that when, for example, in a near-death experience, when the blood stops flowing and the microtubules lose their energy supply, that the quantum information reverts to space-time geometry, but remains entangled as an entity. And if the patient is revived, comes back and says, "Hey, I was floating above my body," or "I had this experience," and that could actually be happening even afterlife if the consciousness remains entangled as a unitary entity, a quantum soul, if you will, outside the body. So I've speculated on that in a paper with Deepak Chopra called The Quantum Soul as a scientific hypothesis. It's just a suggestion. So, as I said before, the mechanism of anesthesia holds the key to understanding consciousness. And how does that work? So, in the 19th century, it was discovered that a group of gases could cause animals to stop functioning. If a salamander or a mouse or a rat or a fruit fly or a dog or a cat or a horse or a human breathed these gases at sufficient concentration, they would fall over and become anesthetized. You can't tell if they're conscious or unconscious, but it's what we now call anesthesia. But the gases were all of different structures. They were inert gases like xenon, halogenated hydrocarbons, ethers, and so forth. But they were all different structures, and for any gas, the exact same amount was required to anesthetize a horse or a fly, a salamander or a human, at the exact same concentration. And this was very strange. So scientists began to search for a common factor among these anesthetic gases that could account for their ability to anesthetize animals. And these two guys, Meyer and Overton in 1901 and Meyer in 1897, working separately, both came to the same conclusion. They found that these anesthetics plotted here going downward is more potent. So this is 1 over potency. So as you go down, you need less and less of the anesthetic to cause loss of consciousness or loss of purposeful behavior. And they found that the potency correlated over many, many orders of magnitude with solubility in olive oil, in a solvent called olive oil. Now, olive oil includes a lot of pi resonance benzene-like molecules. So if you take a body, a human body or any animal body, and look at it in terms of its solubility phases, the anesthetics are binding in the nonpolar, so here's polarity going this way, in the nonpolar aromatic rings with different types of benzene-like molecules, the pi resonance clouds that I was showing earlier. Now, so the idea was that the more potent the anesthetic, the more soluble they were in olive oil. So what did that mean? Well, scientists at the beginning of the 20th century knew that lipid membranes had cholesterol, which were largely fat-like molecules or pi resonance molecules. And so they thought initially that anesthetics acted in lipid phases of neuronal membranes. But in the 1980s, two scientists in England, Franks and Lieb, showed that anesthetics acted in the nonpolar hydrophobic, water-avoiding regions that I showed you in the mice cells inside the proteins, and that anesthetics acted directly on proteins because the excitability of membranes were shown to depend on proteins, ion channels and receptors and so forth. So which proteins? For many years, people thought that neuronal membrane receptor and channel proteins were the prime candidates. For example, the GABA receptor shown here, and they do bind anesthetics. And in fact, the gas anesthetics bind to these different types of receptors, and propofol, etomidate, and ketamine bind to these receptors. So the anesthetics do bind to these receptors, but the results of studies on the anesthetics on individual ion channels and receptors were inconclusive and inconsistent. So one anesthetic would cause a channel to open, another would cause it to close. Some anesthetics wouldn't bind to this receptor. So there was no consistent unitary story. And eventually in 2008, this view was kind of shown to be incorrect. So could it be microtubules? Well, I would have hoped so, and it turns out that indeed it looks like anesthesia does act on microtubules. And this is known due to the work of Eckenhoff, Rod Eckenhoff and his group at the University of Pennsylvania. And for example, they used radio-labeled anesthetic in mouse brain and showed that it binds to 74 different proteins in the mouse brain, half membrane proteins and half in cytoplasm, including tubulin, the component protein of microtubules. So they knew that the anesthetic binds to all these proteins, but which was mediating the functional effect? And the way to ask that is to do proteomics and genomics to see which of these proteins had their gene expression changed, and that's an indication that of the functional effect. And so proteomics and genomics pointed to cytoskeletal microtubules mediating functional anesthetic effects. And so they came out with this paper in 2008 and have done several other studies. And for example, patients who are on a drug called Taxol, which is an anti-cancer drug which acts by stabilizing microtubules, causes these patients to need more anesthesia because the Taxol binding to microtubules prevents the anesthetic to getting to their binding site. They also did a study on using this anesthetic, which is a fluorescent anthracene, which binds to, which they gave to, which is only anesthetic when it fluoresces, when you add ultraviolet light. So they gave it to tadpoles. This is a bit hard to see. And the tadpoles would swim around, they were fine. But then tadpoles have transparent heads, which is convenient. And when they would shine ultraviolet light at them, the tadpoles would go belly up. They would become unresponsive, essentially anesthetized. And they then ground up their brains and analyzed where the anthracene was, and it was bound to microtubules. And they were kind enough to say that this was consistent with our theory, which they called quantum mobility theory, but basically the same thing. So this indicates that anesthesia is acting through microtubules. So we were very happy to hear that. So, and this is consistent with what I showed before, that anesthetic is preventing these dipole oscillations in the tubulin in microtubules, and that prevents consciousness. So my colleagues, Travis Craddock and Jack Jasinski and their students, did another study, which is computer simulation of, we got rid of the complications of a whole animal and just looked at two benzenes in simulations that would oscillate back and forth due to these dipole oscillations, and at room temperature, at ambient temperature, they oscillate at 68 terahertz for a pair of pi resonance clouds. We then simulated the presence of a halothane molecule nearby, which is an anesthetic, and we showed that halothane increases the frequency above available energy, effectively dampening the terahertz oscillations. So when the anesthetic is there, the system vibrates too fast for the available energy and just stops, it just shuts down. And we think that's what causes anesthesia. Well, that was for one anesthetic. We've since done it for a bunch of anesthetics, weak anesthetics going progressively stronger and getting a pretty good Meyer-Overton type curvature correlating between their oil-gas partition and their oscillation frequency, and you can plot it versus anesthesia potency. And there are two gases that are oddballs. They follow Meyer-Overton, but they are not anesthetics. They cause seizures, for example. And they are not on the curve, and we think this is supportive of the idea that this effect is what causes anesthesia, that the anesthetics affect the very fast terahertz oscillations in the pi resonance clouds in the tubulin, inside the microtubules, which slows everything down. Okay, the last point I want to make is that if this idea is correct, if microtubules are vibrating in these different frequencies, including, for example, megahertz, then affecting their megahertz vibrations should affect mental states. So there are various types of non-invasive brain stimulation techniques. You may have heard of transcranial magnetic stimulation, shown here, transcranial electrical stimulation, which have effects on mental states. Electrical stimulation is supposedly like a double espresso, and magnetic stimulation kind of knocks out certain parts of the brain, but they don't really know how it works. Well, what about megahertz mechanical vibrations into the brain? Megahertz mechanical vibrations, and we know microtubules resonate in megahertz, is ultrasound. And ultrasound has been used in in medical imaging for almost 100 years. For example, looking at a fetus in the uterus. We use it in anesthesia to look for the jugular vein when we're trying to put a line in, or nerves when we're doing a nerve block. And so we're quite familiar with it. We have ultrasound machines sitting around. And I went to the literature and found that a scientist named Jamie Tyler had been doing studies of ultrasound on animals, showing behavioral effects and also electrophysiological effects, and started a company, was making these ultrasound devices, although we hadn't got to clinical trials yet, and raised money to change mood with ultrasound and electricity, although he went into electrical effects first. But you can see that these headsets make you sexy and beautiful, apparently, just by putting them on. So we decided to try it, and I suggested to my colleagues in anesthesia we should try this on our chronic pain patients who are depressed. Maybe they'll improve their mood. And my colleagues said, well, we don't try it on anybody until we try it on ourselves first. This was your idea. You got a shaved head. You go first. And so there I am, and I tried it on myself first, and then my colleague did it for me, and this is quite literally my brain on ultrasound. There's my skull, and there's my frontal and temporal cortex shown here. And we published this paper in 2013, Transcranial Ultrasound, Effects on Mental States, and we showed that 15 seconds of right frontotemporal ultrasound at very low intensity, we don't want to heat the brain, resulted in about 40 minutes of improved mood. And I noticed the same effect when I did it to myself. I didn't feel anything initially, but after about a minute, I felt pretty good for about an hour. And then we did it in patients, and we saw an improvement. Now, since that time, a number of things have happened. Ultrasound has been shown to remove amyloid plaques and restore memory in a mouse model of Alzheimer's disease from Australia. Recently at UCLA, they used ultrasound to wake somebody up from a coma by focusing on the thalamus. And I already showed you our study. And we're currently doing a study of brain ultrasound effects on Alzheimer's and brain injury at the University of Arizona. So I'll keep you posted on how that turns out. So to wrap up, I want to say that, our theory, ORCA-OR, has been, in 1998, I published a list of 20 testable predictions. And I'm not going to go through them. They're a little bit detailed, but in several categories. And in our 2014 paper, Roger Penrose and I reviewed these, and we counted that of the 20, 6 or 7 have been validated and shown to be true. The other 13 or 14 are still undetermined, and nothing has refuted the theory. So I think this is more experimental verification than any other theory of consciousness. It's not conclusive, certainly, but it's better supported than any other theory, as far as I can tell, and I follow this pretty closely. So let me conclude, but first thank my collaborators, ORCA-OR, Sir Roger Penrose, who, by the way, has a new book, not about consciousness, but about physics in general, challenging some of the modern ideas in modern physics, called Fashion, Faith, and Fantasy in Modern Physics. My collaborators in the anesthetic action and pi resonance oscillation work, Travis Craddock, Jack Tuczynski, and our students, the transcranial ultrasound for Alzheimer's and brain injury at the University of Arizona, and then microtubule research by Anirban Bandyapati in Japan. And we'll be visiting Anirban in December. So to conclude, let me just say the following, that ORCA-OR is a rigorous scientific theory of consciousness with explanatory power spanning neuroscience, cognitive science, philosophy, physics, and medicine, which may underlie other approaches, including global workspace, integrated information, higher order thought, and predictive coding, because these are cognitive architectures and would not be inconsistent at all with ORCA-OR going on inside them. Quantum coherence times of microtubules experimentally shown to be 0.0 milliseconds or longer, suitable for physiology and able to account for consciousness, possibly through beat frequencies. So the idea that the brain is too warm, wet, and noisy for quantum coherence is incorrect. Experiments have shown this. Primitive OR protoconscious pleasure in the primordial soup may have sparked the origin of life and driven evolution toward orchestration and full, rich conscious experience. And I think that evolutionary theory should consider this and be augmented by the possibility, by putting consciousness into biology where it surely exists. And Orca-War may also account for the structure of language and non-local effects, including parapsychology, out-of-body experience, and afterlife, by existing in the structure of space-time geometry. And finally, resonating microtubule megahertz vibrations with transcranial ultrasound may treat Alzheimer's disease and traumatic brain injury. And I think of the various transcranial therapeutic modalities, it's the most promising. And Roger and I wrote a review of our theory in 2014, and you can see it here, or if you send me an email, I'll be happy to send you an electronic copy. And we have a new version coming out in a book in 2016. So all in all, I think our theory is doing quite well. And although we're kind of drowned out by a lot of noise because there's more people looking at it strictly from the cognitive architecture, but I think quantum biology is real and will explain a lot of things pertaining to both the nature and origin of life and consciousness. And so I thank you very much for your attention.
Спасибо за лекцию, было очень познавательно. Я хотел бы уточнить, правильно ли я понял, что когда вводится вещество, которое вызывает анестезию, происходит, значит, изменения в молекулах тубулина и в других, и они не резонируют. То если это так, то как тогда, почему это влияет на квантовое вычисление, о котором вы говорите? Спасибо.
Thank you. And I didn't say this, but anesthetics bind by very weak quantum forces, the London-van der Waals forces. They don't form chemical bonds, they don't form ionic bonds, they don't form covalent bonds. They act just by these very weak quantum forces. So the idea is that they are affecting quantum interactions and nothing else, which is probably why they don't cause other effects in the brain. The membranes can still be active. The patient can have other brain activity. The brain is still quite active under anesthesia. So basically, the only thing that's missing is consciousness and formation of memory. So therefore, the conclusion is that anesthetics act by quantum forces on quantum activities in the brain without affecting other types of activities.
Можно? Okay. Опять-таки с благодарностью за все то, что вы уже сказали. А вопрос вот к той тревожной и немножко параноической части, ну для меня лично, про Декарта. Как ваша теория, я понимаю, что это уже скорее будет вопрос не к теоретизированию, а к гипотетизированию, но все-таки. Как ваша теория помогает решить вот эту нерешаемую задачу о мозге, который находится под воздействием злого гения, и, возможно, вся реальность и наше сознание являются иллюзией? Есть ли там какой-то байпас? Спасибо.
It gives an alternative to that. I think that it shows how consciousness can be real and how we can experience reality directly rather than being a mystery. So if you're asking, could we still be a brain in a vat? I suppose that's true, but even then we have the problem of consciousness in the brain. If the evil genius is putting information in, we still have the question of how we're having the conscious experience in the brain. You'd like that answer? Okay.
Спасибо большое за то сообщение, которое вы нам сегодня сделали. У меня два вопроса. Первый вопрос. Скажите, пожалуйста, каким образом после наркоза возникает когнитивное нарушение сознания? И какую роль играют в этом микротрубочки? Это первый вопрос. А второй вопрос. Как вы думаете, что происходит в нашем сознании за пределами нашего воображения? Спасибо.
The first question, I think relates to what we call postoperative cognitive dysfunction. Patients who have multiple anesthetics sometimes lose memory, and they get basically Alzheimer's. And if somebody has Alzheimer's, it can be triggered or worsened by anesthesia. And the pathology of postoperative cognitive dysfunction from too many anesthetics is essentially the same as Alzheimer's. They both seem to involve disruption of the microtubules. They destabilize. The tau protein falls off the microtubules, gets hyperphosphorylated, or gets hyperphosphorylated and then falls off. But either way, you get the tau protein off the microtubules. The microtubules destabilize because the tau seems to stabilize the microtubules. We don't know whether the microtubules destabilize first and then the tau falls off, or the tau falls off and then the microtubules destabilize. But either way, the pathology is that the microtubule is destabilized and the tau protein is not doing its job. It's making clumps in the corner of the brain. So we hope in the future to attempt to treat that with ultrasound because we think it's going to. We hope that it will also help in Alzheimer's, and it should help in postoperative cognitive dysfunction, because we know from experiments I didn't show you from Anirban Bandyapati's work that stimulation at 2 megahertz promotes the polymerization of microtubules, and we think that the ultrasound may help treat Alzheimer's and postoperative cognitive dysfunction by causing the microtubules to reassemble and become more normal again, and the tau would then go back on it. What? Oh, the other question, it was something about beyond our imagination.
Что происходит за пределами нашего воображения, с сознанием? Что происходит с сознанием за пределами нашего воображения?
I'm not sure I understand your question, but if you go back to that slide I showed with the from the neuron down to the microtubules, a spectrum of dynamics. If you go further to the right, faster, I think meditative states, altered states, maybe even out-of-body experiences are occurring at faster frequencies, which could be independent of biology. So meditators, for example, their baseline frequency shifts to become faster. And I think in certain altered states and meditative states, beyond the imagination, as you say, we go further to the right to go faster and deeper. The Beatles once sang, the deeper you go, the higher you fly, the deeper you go. And I think that applies here, that as you go deeper into the structure of the brain, into the microtubules, into the quantum level of the microtubules, and then into the structure of space-time geometry, the more intense the experience, the more in touch you are perhaps with Platonic wisdom embedded in the universe, and more like Eastern spiritual approaches. So I think I would put it on that spectrum as you go further to the right, faster and deeper into the structure of the universe.
Здравствуйте. Вот философы много веков обсуждали вопрос о соотношении сознания и внешнего мира. Вот. Есть множество теорий на этот счет. Вот. И сейчас успехи нейробиологии достаточно хорошо подтверждают эти воззрения. То есть области мозга, есть нейронные сети, они получают ощущения от мира через органы чувств, возбуждаются очень многие области. И все это очень хорошо описывается, и уже сейчас можно по нейронной активности видеть, что человек воображает или видит. Вот. И представляете, что ваша теория, она должна была привести к какой-то совершенно другому сознанию человека, то есть принципиально другому, потому что квантовые явления, как известно сейчас, частицы на миллиарды световых лет могут быть коррелированы. Вот. Мы бы ощущали весь мир, вот, ощущали ощущения других людей напрямую, например. То есть представляете, что сознание было бы совершенно другим. чем то, как сейчас это достаточно хорошо описывается нейронными сетями. Вот как вы можете это прокомментировать?
I don't think neural networks explain it all whatsoever. I think neural networks fail to explain the hard problem. They fail to explain real-time conscious control because consciousness comes too late. They fail to explain binding, how we have all disparate information coming in that gets unified into one common conscious experience. So I don't agree that neural networks explain it all. In fact, they hardly explain anything. Because it's just an assumption that consciousness emerges at a high level of complex computation. And in any case, those neural networks have microtubules and quantum processes going on within them. So if anything is explained by the neural network, it might depend on activities going on at a deeper level, quantum processes in the microtubules within it, which also gives you binding, a unitary conscious experience, and the ability to respond in real time as opposed to consciousness being epiphenomenal. So it gives you the possibility of free will acting in real time. So I wouldn't agree with the assertion that neural networks explain it all. I don't think they explain much at all. I don't think they explain it.
Okay, thank you. It's impressive. And after all, we are talking about quantum physics and its effect. So the difference between multi-world and Copenhagen, essentially, so there is no observable differences. So it's more
Between what? I'm sorry.
Between multi-world collapsing, between Copenhagen collapsing model and multi-world model. It's all about collapsing. It's all about collapsing.
Well, there's
right?
no collapse in multiple worlds.
Yeah, right. It's okay. The explanation of the effect. So, but there is no visible difference between those models. So it's more philosophical than scientific discussion. However,
Well, I have to disagree with you because multiple worlds, posits that there are all these infinite number of universes, and the view I take is that there's not. There's only one universe.
Well, let me continue. So there is no visible differences, observable differences. However, for the objective collapsing, there is visible difference as far as I understand when, for example, light, the coherent source is far away, then at some point after the delay, the interference should stop. The question is at which times, at which delays, as you explained, the interference should stop. We should stop observe interference of coherent light.
I'm not sure I'm following, but if you're saying interference meaning quantum superposition, it would terminate when the threshold for objective reduction is met by E equals h over t.
Well, so what time is it?
Well, t is the time. And time t equals h bar, Planck's constant, actually the Planck-Dirac constant, over E sub g, where E sub g is the magnitude of the superposition.
Okay, so for example, what's the time for 1 GeV photon?
For one?
For 1 GeV photon. We have photon with energy 1.
Well,
1
photons
GeV.
are massless, so I'm not sure how to answer that.
Okay, for 1 GeV electron.
For what?
For 1 GeV electron.
For
has
one
mass.
electron.
Yes.
Okay, by E equals h over t, we actually calculated this, and it would be something like 10,000 years. Because E is very small, t would be very long. Whereas a 1 kilogram cat is very large, and it would self-collapse in something like 10 to the minus 25th seconds, something like that. So something very small, like an electron, in superposition, assuming it didn't interact with any other superposition, wouldn't reach threshold for collapse for 10,000 years. And the intensity of the experience would be very, very weak. Whereas if you have a large mass in superposition, like a 1 kilogram object, it would self-collapse very quickly and the experience would be intense. So it's a spectrum. It's kind of like photons. You have high energy photons at high frequencies that have high intensities, and slower photons, lower frequency, longer wavelength.
Okay, I see. And for those tubulars, what is the time of collapsing?
For tubular.
Yes.
That's an interesting question because when we first came up with our theory, we had to consider whether the tubulins were in superposition at the level of the whole protein separated from itself, or from the level of the individual, from the atomic nuclei inside the protein, or from the protons and neutrons inside those atomic nuclei. And we actually did the calculation. It's in our 1996 paper, and we calculated for all three. And the highest energy, and therefore the dominant effect, occurred with atomic nuclei. So in the middle, not the largest, not the smallest, but the middle one had the highest energy. And it turns out that the atomic nuclei just need to be separated from themselves by their diameter. So a nucleus just needs to be separated from itself, which is femtometers. So 10 to the minus 15 meters, so very, very slight. It also turns out that the pi resonance, the movement of an electron by 1 nanometer, by the Mossbauer effect and recall, affects the movement of its atomic nuclei strictly by its diameter. So that works out very well in the theory, that the pi resonance oscillation of a nanometer would affect the displacement of the nuclei just by their diameter. So it works out perfectly.
May I just first jump onto your defense, because actually the gentleman isn't correct when saying that there's no testifiable differences between the multivert interpretation.
I agree with you. I think there's a huge difference.
Yeah, there is. Now, the question I wanted to explore in the same direction about the measurement problem. But again, jumping to your defense, what I'm questioning is the relation with Penrose interpretation, which you, I see, are using as the sort of validation for your theory, which is brilliant, by the way. I'm really enjoying it. It's very enlightening. What I'm trying to say is that Penrose interpretation, one of the conditional collapse theories, and it uses a sort of an ad hoc condition for causing a collapse. What it will, in reality, will mean that the object can exist in superposition states, and also that there are collapses, and there are collapses in those brain tube. This is what you need for a theory to work. Now, what I'm failing to see is that why do you really need this theory of a conditional collapse instead of any theory of objective collapse? For example, GRW, which also work, and it maybe even work better with your theory.
Right. Well, first of all, GRW doesn't posit consciousness as part of it. And GRW is ad hoc, I think. 10 to the 17th particles causes collapse. That's just, from some measurement. So I don't think Penrose objective reduction is ad hoc. I think it's a logical deduction based on something outside the system and the need for something to account for the measurement problem. And if you want to ascribe awareness to something fundamental and irreducible in the structure of the universe, you need to connect quantum mechanics to general relativity or quantum gravity, whatever you want to call it, and that's exactly what he's done, at least conceptually, and also mathematically in some other papers. So I think the objective reduction connects general relativity and quantum mechanics, puts consciousness into the universe, into science, as a fundamental property of the universe due to this instability in space-time geometry. I mean, many people, Tononi and Koch and all these other people with their cognitive architecture theories realize they can't explain consciousness, so then they bring in panpsychism. Well, it must be panpsychism. But that's ad hoc because they don't say whether it's at the level of the whole brain, the protein, the neuron, the atomic nuclei, the protons, the neutrons, the quarks, whatever. We've done that calculation, as I told this gentleman, and it occurs to the level of the atomic nuclei being separated. So I would say GRW is ad hoc, but I don't think Penrose is ad hoc, although it is a postulate. But it's a testable postulate because, in fact, it's being tested right now. There are experiments underway where you put a mirror that has in superposition. Baumeister's group is doing this, and they hope to have sufficient mass to be in superposition to collapse in a time frame they can measure. So the objective reduction by E equals h over t is being tested. Now, if that proves to be true, that wouldn't prove that collapse causes consciousness. You wouldn't know whether the mirror is having a moment of awareness. So that part remains to be to be tested. And that's a really difficult question to prove. That's probably quite literally the hard problem of trying to prove it. The best experiment I could come up with is if you have a system, for example, quantum resonances in microtubules show that it's inhibited by anesthesia, by one anesthetic, say halothane. And then you know that another anesthetic is half as potent. Then it would take, if you do the same experiment with the other anesthetic, isoflurane, it takes twice as much anesthetic. And then you do with another one, and then you plot the effect, kind of like the Meyer-Overton curve, or what we showed for the effect on a pi resonance oscillation, and show that there's a correlation between the potency of the anesthetic and the effects on the quantum resonance going away, that it's proportional to the potency of the anesthetic. I think that's the best you could do in the near future until or unless we get to a point where we're able to download consciousness into some system, and then you come back and say, yeah, I was in that brain in a vat, or I was in that computer, and it was this and that. But I think that's way in the future, if at all possible.
And you were not put off by the fact that if Penrose's interpretation is correct, then consciousness will be indeed intrinsic quality of the space-time itself.
It's an intrinsic quality of collapse, which is an intrinsic property of space-time geometry. So mass and space-time are constantly going into superposition and constantly collapsing, like waves in the ocean, but everywhere all the time. So it's happening here, happening everywhere, and it's an intrinsic property of the universe. But those types of proto-conscious events need to be orchestrated to give the kind of consciousness we have, and that's where biology and microtubules come in.
Okay, great. Just one more question in a different direction a little bit. So you mentioned that this sort of feel-good, I don't know.
Proto-consciousness.
Yes. So it has a sort of, it's a mechanism for development. Okay, I'll step back. Normally we consider that there is something called past hypothesis, which that means that entropy was very low, and some previous part where was the event which was
You talking about the universe, or?
It doesn't have to be the universe, but because it's a deterministic theory, it is per se reversible. So to make sure that we have past and the future, we need an additional hypothesis, which is typically called past hypothesis.
Yeah.
Which,
You're talking about the arrow of time.
Exactly.
Well, I actually have a paper on that, and what I would say is that, as you know, there's nothing in physics that says that you can't go backwards and forwards in time, except the second law of thermodynamics. And you can get around that in various ways. But what I think is that collapse is irreversible. And once you have collapse, you have a definite state, and you can't go backwards through the collapse. So I think consciousness creates the arrow of time.
Consciousness creates the arrow of time.
Yeah.
I'm very sorry to interrupt. Yes, but I have to say it. We are out of time, and it was last question, and we have to stop Q&A session. But if you can have an opportunity to ask Stuart other questions after that. Thank you so much for the lecture.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.